What is the most scariest but still unexplained thing that you have experienced? I'll never forget that night, though I've tried to put it out of my mind so many times. The memory creeps back in unexpected moments, in the quiet when I'm alone, or sometimes when the cold sinks deep into my bones like it did that winter in Alberta. It's been 12 years, and you'd think the edges of that night would have softened, blurred by the passage of time, but they haven't. If anything, they've become sharper, more vivid, especially the eyes. It was early January, and the cold felt like it was trying to swallow the world whole. If you've never experienced an Alberta winter, you might not understand what that kind of cold does to you. It's not just the temperature, though. That night it had dropped to minus 30 degrees Celsius, which is enough to make your breath freeze in the air. It's the way everything feels dead, like the earth has gone still, holding its breath until spring. No wind, no animals, no sound, except for the crunch of tires on snow and the low hum of an engine trying to stay alive. My friend Melissa and I were driving home from a party out in the sticks, way out past town, in the kind of place where roads turn into long stretches of nothing. We weren't the kind of girls to party hard. Neither of us drank or did any of that stuff. We were good girls, I guess, if you want to put it that way, more into the company of our own little circle than the wild things going on around us. That night, the party had been tame enough, mostly just us and a few friends, talking about nothing important. But when it ended, we lingered a little too long, standing outside in the cold, wrapped up in layers, trying to prolong the night, because we knew we'd be back to school soon, back to normal life. It was about 3 a.m. when we finally left. Melissa was driving. She'd always been the more responsible. She'd gotten her dad's old Buick when she turned 16, a real tank of a car that seemed almost indestructible. I remember thinking how safe I felt in that thing, even on icy roads. But now, looking back, I realize how foolish that was. No car could protect us from what we saw that night. We were only about 5 or 6 minutes outside of town, cruising along at around 80 kilometers per h, 50 miles per hour. It was one of those long, lonely stretches of highway that feel like they could go on forever. The snowbanks were piled high along the roadside, and the trees looked dead, stripped bare by the winter. There was something eerie about how still everything was. Melissa was talking non-stop, something about the party, or maybe it was about a guy she liked. I can't really remember. I wasn't paying much attention to her words. My mind was wandering, staring out the window, letting the dark shapes of the trees blur as we sped past them. The heater in the car was doing its best, but it couldn't quite fight off the deep chill that seeped in through the windows. That's when I saw it. At first it was just a flicker, like a reflection in the corner of my eye. You know how your brain tries to rationalize things? I thought it was probably an animal, maybe a deer, or even a moose, though moose aren't usually out in the open that time of year. They stick to the woods. But the more I looked, the more I realized this wasn't anything normal. It started with the eyes. 2 glowing eyes, reflecting the car's headlights, staring straight at us. But they were too high off the ground, much higher than any deer or animal I'd ever seen. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. I blinked, thinking maybe I was just tired, maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But when I looked again, they were still there. 2 piercing points of light in the darkness, hovering about 7 or 8 feet off the ground. "Melissa," I said, my voice shaky. She didn't seem to hear me, still rambling on about whatever had been on her mind. "Melissa, look." "What?" She glanced over at me, annoyed, and then her eyes followed where I was pointing. That's when she saw it too. The look on her face changed instantly. She went pale, her mouth half open in shock. The headlights caught more of it as we got closer, illuminating the thing in short bursts. It wasn't just the eyes. There was a shape, a tall, hulking figure, standing in the middle of the road. It didn't move. It just stood there, like it was waiting for us. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel the blood rushing in my ears. "What the hell is that?" Melissa whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know," I said. My stomach twisted into knots. I wanted to scream, but the words got stuck in my throat. The figure was massive, had to be at least 8 feet tall, maybe more. Its outline was strange, like it was wearing something heavy, bulky, almost like thick fur or tattered clothes. But that didn't make sense. No person would be out here in this weather, in the middle of the road, dressed like that. And no animal stood upright like this, unmoving, like it was waiting for us to do something. Melissa slowed the car down, instinctively I think, but she didn't stop. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, and the air in the car felt thick, like neither of us could breathe properly. "Do we stop?" she asked, her voice trembling. I shook my head, too scared to say anything. We were close now, close enough to see the details. And that's when everything felt wrong. Really, deeply wrong. It wasn't just tall, it was impossibly thin, with long limbs that seemed almost out of proportion with its body. The skin, or whatever it had covering it, was pale, a sickly grey-white that stood out against the blackness of the road and the trees. And those eyes, God, those eyes. They weren't just reflecting light, they seemed to glow, like they had their own source of energy, like they were watching us with intent, waiting for something. I felt cold inside, colder than I ever had before, like the thing in the road wasn't just in front of us, it was inside us somehow, spreading its chill. And then, just as we were about to pass it, it moved. The figure, if you could even call it that, stood on two legs, its posture eerily human. But the longer I looked, the less it seemed anything like a person. My mind was struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. It didn't fit. Nothing about it. Its legs were bent backward, like a goat's hind legs, and I could see the thick, dark fur, or was it clothing, hanging from its massive frame. It was bulky, heavy-set, but it didn't move like something that weighty should. It stood unnaturally still, almost as if it was waiting for us. But that wasn't even the worst part. The horns. They curled from its head, jagged and broken in places, rising into the night air like the twisted branches of some cursed tree. They were impossibly large, too large for anything that should exist outside of nightmares. I couldn't make out much of its face, thank God, but there was enough in those few seconds to see that its eyes, those glowing, unnatural eyes, were locked onto us. My blood ran cold. I don't know how else to describe it. There was this overwhelming sense of dread that hit me all at once, like something deep inside me knew this thing was wrong, fundamentally in a way that went beyond just fear. It was a primal kind of terror, the kind that comes from something you can't fight or escape, something that shouldn't. My entire body tensed up, and I felt like I was rooted to my seat, paralyzed. I glanced at Melissa. Her face had drained of color, her knuckles white as she gripped the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. Her eyes were wide, glued to the road, and I could tell she was seeing the same thing I was. Neither of us said a word, but we didn't have to. We were both feeling it. The same awful, gut-wrenching sense of something being horribly wrong. Time seemed to slow down, like everything was happening in a dream, or maybe a night. The headlights cut through the snow in front of us, illuminating the figure in brief, sickening flashes. It was too close now, too real. I wanted to scream, but my voice wouldn't come. My body wouldn't move. I was frozen in terror, staring at this thing as we drove past it. Melissa, thank God, kept her foot on the gas. The car didn't slow any more than it already had, though the tires skidded slightly on the icy road as she swerved around the figure. We were so close that I could hear a sound, a low, guttural noise, almost like a growl, coming from it. Or maybe it was just my imagination, I don't know. But the memory of that sound has stayed with me, deep in the pit of my stomach ever since. As we passed, I caught a glimpse of something that made my heart stop. It turned its head, slowly, deliberately. Its eyes followed us, glowing in the dark, unblinking, as if it knew exactly what we were, exactly who we were. The movement was so unnaturally slow, like it had all the time in the world, like it wasn't afraid of us. It didn't move to chase us, didn't seem alarmed in any way, just watched, like it was letting us go, like it wanted us to know it could come for us whenever it wanted to. For a moment, I thought it would step into the road, that we would hit it head on, and the image of it crashing through the windshield filled my mind in vivid detail. The glass shattering, the thing's twisted limbs reaching for us. But it didn't. It stayed rooted in place, those horrible eyes locked onto our car until we were out of sight. The second we were past it, Melissa slammed her foot down on the gas, and the car shot forward. The engine roared louder than it had all night, and for a split second, I thought we'd lose control on the ice. But she kept us steady, her hands still gripping the wheel with a ferocity I'd never seen before. Neither of us spoke. The silence between us was thick, suffocating, filled with all the things we couldn't say because we were too scared to even acknowledge what we had just seen. I looked into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure standing there in the middle of the road, still watching us, or worse, coming after us. But there was nothing, just the dark, empty stretch of highway and the faint glow of our taillights reflecting off the snow. No sign of it, but that didn't make me feel any better. If anything, it made me feel worse, like the thing was still there, just out of sight, waiting. What the hell was that? Melissa's voice was barely a whisper. Her breathing was shallow, like she was trying to hold back panic, like she was still processing what had just happened. I shook my head, trying to form words, but none came. My throat felt tight, like the fear had gripped me from the inside out. I didn't have an answer for her, and even if I did, I wasn't sure I wanted to say it out loud. Saying it would make it real, and I didn't want it to be. We drove in silence for the next few minutes. The tension in the car thick enough to choke on. Every muscle in my body was tight, my hands clenched in my lap, trying to stop the shaking that had taken over. I couldn't stop thinking about the way it had looked at us, the way it had just stood there, like it belonged to that road, like it was part of the landscape, like we had wandered into its world and not the other way around. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had seen something we weren't supposed to see, something ancient, something dangerous. I kept waiting for the world to snap back into place, for the sense of wrongness to dissipate, but it didn't. Even as we sped away, the chill stayed with me, deeper than the cold outside, like a part of that night had gotten inside me, taken root in my bones. "What the hell was that?" Melissa repeated, louder this time, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I finally managed to say, though my voice felt distant, like it wasn't really mine. "I don't—" she started, then trailed off. Her hands were still tight on the wheel, her knuckles ghost white in the dim light of the dashboard. She was shaking, I realized, just like I was. "That wasn't—" She stopped again, not sure how to finish the sentence. "That wasn't an animal," I said, finally giving voice to the thought that had been gnawing at me. "That wasn't human." Melissa didn't answer, but I could see her swallow hard, her jaw tightening like she was trying to keep herself together. We didn't talk about it for the rest of the drive. In fact, we didn't talk much at all for the next few days. It was like we both needed time to process it, to push it down into the part of our minds where it couldn't touch us, where it couldn't haunt us. But it did. It still does. Even now, 12 years later, the memory of that night still chills me to my core. That thing, whatever it wasn't just something we saw. It was something that saw us, something that let us go. But I've never been sure if that was a good thing. When we finally passed the figure, the lights of town flickered ahead of us, glowing faintly through the winter darkness. They should have been a relief, a sign that we were almost home, that we had escaped whatever it was we'd seen back. But instead, they felt distant, like they belonged to some other world we weren't part of anymore. Melissa hadn't said a word since we passed it. The silence between us felt suffocating, pressing down like a weight I couldn't shake off. My hands were still trembling in my lap, and I could feel the sting of tears in my eyes. I hadn't even realized I was crying until I reached up and wiped them away with the back of my hand. I didn't want to say anything. I didn't want to break the silence and risk sounding insane. Maybe Melissa hadn't really seen it. Maybe it was just me. Maybe I'd hallucinated the whole thing, and if I opened my mouth, I'd say something that would make this all too real. But I had to say something. The fear was gnawing at me from the inside, and I couldn't hold it in any longer. "I must be losing it," I muttered, my voice barely louder than a whisper. I stared out the windshield, watching the snow swirl in the headlights, trying to force the words out, but I thought I saw something back there. To my shock, Melissa didn't brush it off. She didn't laugh. Didn't dismiss me like I half expected her to. Instead, she stayed silent for a beat longer, her grip still tight on the steering wheel. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, almost shaky. No, it's fine," she said, her words soft and slow, like she was still trying to convince herself. I saw it too. The air in the car seemed to change in that moment. The tension didn't go away, but it shifted, like we were both finally admitting to ourselves that what we'd seen wasn't just in our heads. Melissa glanced at me for a second, her eyes wide and fearful, and then back to the road. Did it kind of look like a goat?" she asked. I stared at her, my heart pounding in my chest. For a second, I didn't know what to say. The word goat didn't even begin to cover it. But it was the closest thing either of us could come up. The backward legs, the horns. Nothing about that thing was natural. Goats didn't have that kind of presence, that feeling of wrongness. Still, I nodded, my voice weak when I finally spoke. "Yeah, Kind of. We both went silent again after that, letting the weight of what we had seen settle between us. I could feel the tension in the car, thick like the cold air outside, but neither of us wanted to break it. It was like we were afraid to talk about it too much, afraid that if we did, we'd somehow make it more real. Growing up in rural Alberta, we'd both spent plenty of time outdoors. Our families hunted. We knew the woods, the wild. We knew what elk, deer, and moose looked. Hell, we'd grown up with those animals practically in our backyards. None of them fit what we had seen. Elk and deer didn't stand on two legs, and even if they did, their limbs wouldn't just hang by their sides like that. Bears could stand, but they didn't have backward bending legs or horns. They didn't look like that. Do you think it was... I started, but I couldn't finish the question. I didn't know what I was asking. Didn't know if I even wanted to. I don't know, Melissa said quickly, almost cutting me off. Her voice had an edge of panic to it now, like she was trying to stay calm, but couldn't quite manage. I don't know what it was. We were quiet again for a long time after that. The only sound was the hum of the car's engine and the crunch of the tires on the snow-covered road. The lights of town were getting closer now, but they still felt too far away. My heart was still racing, and I couldn't stop thinking about the figure, its long, twisted limbs, its unblinking eyes. The way it had just stood there, like it belonged to the road, like we were the ones intruding. Melissa's hands hadn't loosened their grip on the wheel, and I could see the way her fingers twitched every so often, like she was ready to swerve again if something else appeared in the road. The silence between us wasn't comfortable, but it felt necessary, like we both needed time to process what we'd just been through. Neither of us could make sense of it, but we both knew that what we had seen wasn't normal. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't anything that should exist. After what felt like hours, we finally reached the edge of town. The streetlights were dim, casting long shadows across the snow, and the houses looked dark and empty, like everyone had long since gone to bed. It should have felt safe, like we were back in the world we knew, but it didn't. The fear was still there, a heavy, suffocating thing that clung to my skin like frostbite. Melissa pulled into the empty parking lot of the gas station near the edge of town. She killed the engine, and for a second, neither of us moved. The silence was louder now, more oppressive without the hum of the car to fill it. I could feel the cold creeping in through the windows, the kind of cold that cuts straight through your layers and settles deep in your bones. But I didn't care. I couldn't move. I just sat there, staring at the dashboard, my hands still shaking in my lap. Melissa let out a shaky breath beside me, the first sound either of us had made in what felt like forever. "Do you think we should tell someone?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I turned to her, my mind racing. Tell someone? Tell them what? That we'd seen some kind of creature on the road that looked like a goat but wasn't? That it had horns and backward legs and glowing eyes? Who would believe us? Hell, I wasn't even sure I believed it, and I'd seen it with my own eyes. "I don't know," I said after a long pause. "What would we even say?" Melissa didn't answer. She just stared straight ahead, her eyes wide and glassy, like she was lost in thought. I knew what she was thinking, though. I was thinking it too. What if it was still out there? What if it was watching us right now? A shiver ran down my spine, and I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to chase away the cold that had settled deep inside. But it wasn't just the cold, it was something else. Something I couldn't shake. The memory of those eyes, the way they had locked onto us, the way they had followed us as we drove by. Like it knew us, like it recognized us somehow. I didn't want to talk about it anymore. I didn't want to think about it anymore, but I knew that wasn't possible. Whatever we had seen, it wasn't something you could just forget. It wasn't something you could just ignore. It was burned into my mind, a permanent scar that I knew would never go away. "I don't think we should," I said finally, my voice trembling. "I don't think anyone would believe us." Melissa didn't say anything for a long time. Then slowly she nodded. "Yeah," she whispered, "you're probably right." We sat there in the parking lot for a few more minutes, both of us too afraid to get out of the car, too afraid to even move. The lights of the gas station flickered overhead, casting long shadows across the snow, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that whatever we had seen on the road was still out there, watching us, waiting for something. But eventually, we had to move. We couldn't stay there forever. "Let's just go home," Melissa said quietly, starting the car again. "We'll talk about it tomorrow, maybe." She trailed off, and I didn't press her. We both knew there wouldn't be any simple answers tomorrow. Whatever we had seen, it wasn't going away. We drove home in silence. And that night, as I lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, I couldn't stop thinking about those eyes, those glowing, unblinking eyes, the way they had followed us. And even now, years later, I still see them in my nightmares. Because deep down, I know that thing is still out there, and someday it might come back. In the days that followed, Melissa and I tried our best to rationalize what we had seen that night on the frozen highway. At first, it was all we could talk over text, in whispered conversations after school, and even late at night when sleep wouldn't come. We went over every detail, replaying the moments in our heads, trying to piece together something that made sense. But no matter how many explanations we tried to come up with, none of them felt right. Nothing fit. It had to be an animal, right? I remember saying one night, lying in bed with the phone pressed to my ear, my voice was shaky, even though I was trying to sound casual. Maybe a bear or something. Maybe we just didn't get a good look at it. Melissa was quiet for a long time on the other end of the line before finally responding. Bears don't have horns, she said softly, and they don't have backward legs. She didn't need to say anything else. I knew she was right. No matter how much we wanted to believe it had been something explainable, something we could file away in the weird but normal category of our lives, we both knew deep down that it wasn't. What we had seen that night wasn't normal. It wasn't something that could be explained away, and that was the part that haunted me the most. The not knowing. The feeling that we had glimpsed something that shouldn't exist, something that didn't belong in our world. As the weeks turned into months, the urgency of the fear started to fade. We talked about it less and less, partly because the more we talked, the more we realized we'd never get answers, and partly because neither of us wanted to dwell on it. It was like staring into a black hole. The more you looked, the more it sucked you in, dragging you deeper into something you couldn't escape. So we pushed it aside. We buried it. We stopped bringing it up unless it was in passing, in half-jokes that didn't quite land because the fear was still there, just beneath the surface. Even as Melissa and I drifted apart in the years that followed, different schools, different friends, different lives, the memory of that night clung to both of us. Every so often, we'd catch up, and without fail, the goat thing would come up in conversation. We never called it anything else, though calling it that didn't do justice to the terror we had felt. It made it sound ridiculous, almost laughable, but neither of us ever laughed about it. Every time it came up, we'd sit in silence for a few seconds afterward, letting the weight of it settle back into place, like an old wound being reopened. I still think about it sometimes, Melissa admitted once, years later when we were both home for the holidays. We were sitting in her parents' kitchen, sipping hot chocolate as snow fell gently outside the window. It had been almost 5 years since that night, but the memory still hung between us like a shadow. Me too, I said quietly. I try not to, but it's like it's always there, in the back of my mind. She nodded, staring into her mug. Do you ever wonder if it's still out there? The question hung in the air between us, heavy and cold, like the winter night we had shared so long ago. I didn't want to answer her, because the truth was I had wondered. Many times. And every time I did, I felt that same deep, instinctual dread creeping up my spine. The fear that whatever it was we had seen, it hadn't just been a one-time thing. It hadn't been some random, fleeting encounter. It was still out there, waiting, watching. I don't know, I finally said, my voice barely more than a whisper, but sometimes it feels like it is. We didn't talk about it much after that. What more was there to say? We had lived with the memory for years by then, and we had learned to push it to the edges of our minds, to keep it at bay. But it never really went away. Not for either of us. There were nights, especially during the long, cold Alberta winters, when I couldn't help but think about it. When the wind howled outside my window and the darkness pressed in from all sides, I would lie awake, staring up at the ceiling, and I'd remember those glowing eyes, the way they had followed us. The way the figure had just stood there, unmoving, like it was waiting for something. And I'd wonder if it was still out, somewhere in the snow and the dark, watching, waiting for the right moment to be seen again. It wasn't just the fear of seeing something strange that haunted. It was the deep, instinctual feeling that we had encountered something that shouldn't exist, something that didn't belong in this world. That was what stuck with me. What kept me up at night, the knowledge that there were things out there, lurking in the shadows, that we didn't understand, things that shouldn't be, but were. Even now, more than a decade later, the memory of that night sends shivers down my spine. I don't talk about it much anymore. Melissa and I have grown apart. Life happened as it does. But every so often, I'll get a text from her, just a simple message out of the blue. Do you still think about it? And I always know exactly what she's asking. Because no matter how much time passes, some things never leave. Some things stay with you, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to remind you they're still there. I still don't know what we saw that night. I've spent years trying to make sense of it, trying to put it into words that don't sound crazy, but I've never been able to. And maybe that's for the best. Maybe some things aren't meant to be understood. Maybe some things are better left unexplained, left in the shadows where they belong. But every once in a while, when the wind howls and the nights are long and dark, I'll catch myself looking out the window, scanning the empty streets and the snow-covered fields, wondering if it's still out there, waiting, watching.